G'day, welcome to i5 TV. i5 TV is a channel that's devoted to addressing and discussing the issues of the day, the issues that are impacting the world around us, whether they're geopolitical, economic, social, or cultural. We seek to bring a particularly Asian sensibility to these issues, and we do that by discussing the issues not only from the point of view of Asia, but also from the point of view of mobilising the voices from Asia itself. My name is Warwick Powell. I'm an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia and a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute in Beijing. I'm also the founding chair of Smart Trade Networks, a trade facilitation and software research and development company. Okay, well, welcome to the show, Einar Tangen, and it's great to see you again. What I wanted to do was to pick your brains a little bit about the work that you've been doing in the area of civilizations. Some years ago, Samuel Huntington wrote a very famous book called The Clashes of Civilisations. And I think that the work that you're doing perhaps turns that on its head, or at least gives it a very different twist, and that is to start people talking about and thinking about what's involved in creating a concert of civilizations. So perhaps you can illuminate us a little bit about some of your thinking and your thought processes around this question of civilizations in a complex multipolar world.
Okay. Warwick, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sorry, I'll probably have to disappoint you and everyone who's reading this with my quote insights. What I can say about this is you have to remember Samuel Huntington was basically, he was the preacher to the choir. He was talking about civilizations, but he was, wrapped up in this idea that civilization equals the last 350, 400 years of colonial domination. Involving Europe and nothing to do with civilization. It's just a an empire that rose, had certain characteristics, and then now it's in decline, and it's trying to deal with that. Not always in the best way, but most empires in decline don't deal with it very well. I mean, look at the situation that France is confronting, not only in HeHe right now, but also in the Sahel region of Africa. 5 countries have basically said, we have resources, we have everything, we have gold, and yet we have no food. And then they realized, one country, that they were selling yellow cake. The stuff you make, it fuels uranium nuclear power plants, uranium, for 80 cents euro to the French, who would then promptly turn around and sell it for 200 euros for the same amount. And they said, look, this is absolutely idiotic. You have a place like HeHe, which was dominated. Actually, there was a slave rebellion, first slave rebellion to successfully get rid of the French. The French turned around and says, well, okay, we left, but in order to maintain peace, you have to pay us reparations. And those reparations have cost HeHe so significant. And it only just kind of disappeared, maybe 20, 25 years ago. So this was going on for a long period of time. They're basically sucking dry this country that they conquered and they stole from to begin with, used them as slaves, or brought in slaves, used them, and then they said, oh, you have to pay us for the right to be free. And you can see the natural going. So when we talk about Huntington's civilization, it's really, I think, based on a very short-sighted view. The civilizations really occur because of a pooling of ideas. They're based on philosophy, literature, art, poetry, governmental systems, shared values, things like this. So if you go back and you talk about Chinese civilization, there are many components to it. I reject this notion, though, that everything was fine. China went through many periods, often very bloody. But they believed that at the end of this, there was this sense of China that there was a series of shared values, not one set. Remember, you had Buddhism, you had Confucianism, and you had Taoism, all here at the same time. And instead of struggling against each other, although there were times, they actually kind of enriched each other. And ironically, the Buddhism that came in from India came to China, and then from China, guess where it went? To Japan. So Japan has had this kind of succession where it has been adopting, these civilizational values. And those are things. So when I talk about civilization, it's really the glue that binds a society together. It can be aspirational to a certain extent, but generally it has to do with these kind of strong cultural elements, which people can identify are part of the fabric of who they are. So Huntington starts off with this, Clash of Civilization, assuming that, somehow the the colonial empire period was a legitimate civilization. It really isn't. I mean, it's one of the more short-lived. If you look at the period of history, it was extremely brutal. It shared that with other civilizations and things like that. But it didn't really have a time to coalesce and develop into something where you have shared values. Now, he would say, oh, no, we do. We share this sense that democracy, okay, and free markets and liberalism, these are things that are very important. Well, define them, and how do you marry them to the system today? If you look at it, there's a recent poll by an independent group. They do this trust poll, the Edelman Trust Poll. And they were looking at the US and China, and it's the exact reverse of what you would expect if you read the headlines of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Chinese have a very high approval rating and trust of their systems. US has incredibly low, yet the US is telling the world that you should emulate us, all right? Although we have nothing to offer you, you should be following us because we have, quote, civilizational values. But that isn't working out, neither in the US nor in the rest of the world. I mean, we all know 70 elections will happen this year. 4.2 billion people will go to the polls and choose the government, or at least vote for a government. Some won't show up. Some will feel constrained in their choices, etc. But change is afoot. Is it based on civilizational values? No, I don't think so. I think Huntington would, try to say that it's a clash between authoritarianism and democracy, and that's a lot of tosh. All the things that we associate with government are not. These are systems. How you get there is not important. Whether I walk, I bicycle, or I take a car, a fast train, or a plane, I have a destination. I have aspirations, right? And at the end of the day, the vehicle I use to get there should be somewhat efficient. It should be something that is tolerable to my society and things like this. And right now, democracy is not that vehicle. And it's not that democracy has failed people. It is people have to fail democracies. And what I mean by that is, let's take, for example, the United States. You go back 45 years ago, 62% of people in the United States were middle class. And they tended to vote for a shared future. They said, well, I want to do something for my kids, my grandkids. And a lot of them had gone through hardships. They remembered, World War II. They remembered the famines, World War I, Great Depression, all of these things. And this had them give a sense that if you don't prepare for the future could be extremely severe. But today that has disappeared. Today in US, it's only 50% and going downward who are middle class. People tend to say, well, I need to get what I can now, right? That is not civilizational. That is just simple selfishness. And you can't run a democracy or a society based on everyone voting for themselves. It just doesn't work. The Donald Trump, me first, Well, if you extend that to everybody, then you have just complete chaos. I'm just voting for whatever's good for me. And if there's enough people who, also think it's good for me, that's great. But the fact is, it's a zero-sum game in this kind of psychological idea. I win, you lose.
This idea, Einar, of a dualism, I guess, as a way of defining civilized and uncivilized, is really reappearing again. Particularly, I noticed in some of the remarks from people like Joe Biden and others who've talked about the present age or the current period of global affairs in those sort of dualist terms. And the practical manifestation of that also seems to see a lot of talk about being in competition with and being rivals with and rivals to or threats to. And yet, despite the effort made by the US to define the world in these terms, it seems that many other parts of the world are actually refusing to accept that as the way of defining the current state and the opportunities and the challenges that we face. And one of those is, I noticed that that the Chinese side actually never accepts the idea that China and America are in competition, and continues to, in a sense, respond with a very different frame. Now, you've been in Beijing now almost 20 years. You've been involved with the Taihe Institute Civilization Initiative for the past 7 or 8 years. Can you tell us a little bit about, in a sense, this different attitude towards what constitutes civilization, and to extend a little bit from those ideas of values and acceptance of difference and things that you were touching upon?
Well, that's a complex question with a lot of parts.
Break it down into a few parts.
Okay, let's see if I can remember. First off, I've only went to Taihe for 3 or 4 years. I don't want to overstate my qualifications. I was just very honored to be asked to be part of it. In terms of Taihe has what they call this civilization forum, and they've been having this for the last 10 years. And what they, we're talking about how do you define a civilization? China's in the middle of what we call a prisoner's dilemma. This is a philosophical approach when you're in a situation where you're like, you're basically under the thumb of somebody. You're a prisoner. And how do you deal with those who are in power? Because you can't directly confront them because they have the power, they'll beat you, okay? But there has to be some sort of a relationship, and the relationship has to be mutually beneficial to the person in charge. Obviously, they don't want you making trouble, beating you might be fun for a while, but it also takes a lot of energy, and then they have to watch you more carefully, and maybe, you get sick and die and things like that. That's frowned on by others or something. Anyways, the issue is, at the end of the day, is that China does not want to confront the U.S. There's no benefit in confronting the U.S. Quite the opposite. They see it as something where they have to cooperate. Now, civilizationally, how does this represent things? In the U.S., I think we've only been 6 or 7 years in our entire history since our founding have we been at peace. We have been involved in conflicts. We have started most of the conflicts in the world that are existing today, or we are heavily involved in them. And we see the world in these kind of black and white terms, especially Biden. Biden is much more like Ronald Reagan. I mean, before Ronald Reagan, you had Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger never apologized for the millions of people that he, killed and, whose lives he affected. His whole outlook on politics was realism. We are a big power. In order to maintain our position as a large power, we have to take any challenge and have an asymmetrical response to it. So you do something small, we will bomb the bejesus out of you, and we won't apologize because this is what big powers do. All right. Then you have Ronald Reagan, who comes in. He's involved in the Iran-Contra affair. He has a distinguishing history of having the most number of cabinet officials who were indicted and convicted of criminal charges. But he kind of turns it on its ear. He starts talking about this shining city on a hill. And this represents a large departure because now the U.S. is positioning itself as right, as morally. It's the white knight, the sheriff in the white hat. We're keeping order. We are the ones bringing civilization. We are the policemen of the world to prevent what? Third World War. And if we have to start the Third World War to prevent it, we will. Okay. So, there's obviously a lot of ironies involved in that. So China is confronted at this time where it's actually easier to deal with, and it's not easy, but I mean, it's easier to deal with Donald Trump because it's purely about power. It's transactional. What can I get from you? All right. I'm going to use my power to extract every ounce of what I can get, but move on. I don't say I'm right. I just say, hey, I'm going to take it. I'm powerful. With Biden, everything comes down to this ideological warfare. I'm right, you're wrong. How do you negotiate with somebody who says I'm right, you're wrong? You can't. It's short-sighted. I mean, and you saw this very clearly, reflected in the Ukrainian situation. They had two attempts, early on to craft a peace process. And both Merkel and Hollande, who were, in charge at the time, have, admitted, 6 months, half a year ago, that they had never had any intention of honoring this peace agreement. That their intention was to just stall for time so that Ukraine could arm itself and get ready and resist an invasion. Obviously, they feel that they were right to do this. They weren't looking at this in power terms. They were looking at purely ideological. So when we start talking about civilization, all right, it's not the same as ideology. Ideology is just a belief system. It's not based on passivity. It's a rationale, right? Civilization's values, all right, come from a long accepted line of what is there. And I don't see Ronald Reagan as forming the basis of a new civilization, no matter how much people like to think that he was a hero who's leading America into a new era. Actually, since his time, we've had great difficulties finding our place in the world in terms of how do we balance this we're right, you're wrong attitude with the realities of a changing world. And you alluded to it earlier. Those who suffered at the hands of colonial powers are not real happy about the colonial powers trying to simultaneously reassert control, but at the same time walk away from promises and responsibilities that they have. When you're talking about global warming, the $100 billion that was promised a year, that was promised to basically the global South to deal with climate change issues, which never appeared. 10% appeared, and the majority of that went in sweetheart deals to entities associated with these colonial countries. So, these are not sort of, this is just realpolitik on one side, ideology on another. Civilization is something very different. So when Huntington talks about civilization, I really have to say I reject his notion that it was a fully formed civilization, that the values were not, they weren't even in existence long enough to become part of a group of values. And you can test that because if you go to different areas, whether it's Europe or the United States, and you ask about these values, you get completely different answers. Whereas if you go to China and you start talking about Confucian or Buddhism or Taoist values, you get, in essence, pretty much the same answers. They might have different ideas of how it can help them and what it means, but there's a continuity, a shared pool of values and that they can express, and you just simply don't get that. So I always reject this notion that Huntington's argument was, I think it was flawed from the beginning because he started with a false premise.
It seems to me then that there's an important distinction, and it might be a subtle one or a nuanced one, between civilization broadly understood and this idea of political empire and an emission of empire, if you will, on the one hand, which is that black and white political rationality. But the other thing that I'm sensing too is that civilizations have cultivated through long passage of time ways of coping with difference a lot better than how empires actually approach this issue of difference. So the empire rationality is actually about subsuming difference, either by converting the other to become more like the empire's personality, if you will, to become mini-me's. And if they can't be subsumed, then they'll just be destroyed. Whereas long-standing empires seem to navigate this issue of difference quite differently, if you will.
Well, yeah, I mean, the colonial empires that were created were based on conquest. The idea that they discovered, the idea you step on a piece of land, put down a flag, and say, I claim this for my country, which is, 7,000 kilometers away, and the people are looking at you who are living there, saying, "You've been discovered." Oh my goodness. And your point about right and wrong. I mean, you have the Catholic Church and the Spanish Inquisition, very much along that lines. And they took it one step further and said, well, we want to convert you, but we can't be entirely sure that you're telling the truth, that you're really a convert. So we're going to basically kill you and let God sort it out, because ultimately he's the final judge. So it kind of worked hand in hand. I don't see it as political. I saw it as economic. The Spanish saw untold hordes of gold and silver in the New World, and they were there to rape and pillage. And the local natives, apart from being a workforce, to the extent that they could upset that, they needed to be dealt with very severely. And they did. I mean, you're talking about the indigenous people of both North and South America were eviscerated to the tune of 92%, dead. And some of it, as was just through disease. We brought presents with unknown consequences with us. So it's in an early stage, conquests are extremely aggressive. It's look at Rome. They didn't walk into Greece and say, "Hey, we're these barbarians from the north, and we just kind of want to take your culture and learn from you." No, they conquered it, and then they took the bits and pieces that they thought were useful, and they adopted it. Part of it was this: they were the barbarians, so they were adopting what they perceived to be a higher degree of civilization that they had in essence destroyed and subsumed. But that is the nature of empire. Human beings have not changed in recorded history. We tend to make the same mistakes. We start off very arrogantly, and the arrogance continues to a certain point where it becomes unbearable, and you have people reacting to it. Maybe they're arrogant, maybe it's a revolution, who knows, but it always falls. All these things that we're trying to put together. Now, in terms of how countries deal with differences, as I was alluding to earlier, there's something called HeHe culture. And this in a place called Taihe, it's a mountainous areas, facing very near the coast, facing towards Taiwan and things like this. And what happens, you had a confluence of very, very powerful, religions and philosophies. And then that was Taoism, which was about studying this idea of action and reaction, and what happens doing nothing is an action, and things like this. And then you had Buddhism, which was very active in saying, look, search for spiritual enlightenment, you're reborn, there's this kind of an ongoing enlightenment process. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, if you remember that type of thing. And then of course you had Confucianism, which was very structured. It was not written probably by one man, but it was the assembly of a tremendous amount of cultural, civilizational values that made up the structure of China's social and political life. And these were things that were known to people. So as I said, if you walked around during that period and you said, okay, Confucianism, what does it stand for? They would tell you the tenets of Confucianism. and things like that. You know, a peasant wouldn't be able to have a long discourse about it, but they would understand the elements of it, especially this hierarchical structure, and to a greater lesser degree with these other entities. So they all were in this town of Taizhou, and instead of fighting, right, they actually interacted, despite the fact that they were, very, very different. And this is markedly different from, for instance, the Christian religion, where you had Protestants and Catholics, basically slaughtering each other for a period of 100 years till they arrived at the point where they were so bankrupt and so tired of killing that they signed this Treaty of Westphalia to say, look, what you do in your country is your business. What I do in my country is my business. And above that, we just trade and we forget everything. Just handle your own affairs. And that's actually brought in and ushered in a lot of peace. But you didn't have these kind of wars in the East. Why? Well, I mean, the way I look at it is there was not this kind of aggressive conquest idea. These things were basically the tenets of how people conducted themselves individually, philosophically, and within society. So they were able to actually add to each other. And that was very important. Taizhou became the springboard for a gentleman who was there, Taizhou. He then used what he learned. He strengthened his Buddhist outlook, and he took that to Japan. And to this day, he is worshipped as a living, he's dead, but as a Buddha, as somebody who contained the spiritual enlightenment. And you have statues of him all over Japan to show you the kind of reach and influence that it had. So, yeah, I mean, these civilizational values, very, very different from empire values, from ideological rationalizations that we come up with for taking whatever it is that we want. Those are kind of threadbare, but they're not civilization.
This HeHe idea, I mean, I heard you speak a little bit about that at an event last year, and it might be worth just explaining that the two characters mean different things, but brought together, they sort of create a particular symbiosis.
Yes, there were two kind of wild poets, and they were very, very good close friends. And they used to spend a lot of time in the natural settings. And one of them was always carrying, a pot with something to eat in it, and the other was carrying something like, something very, very natural. And when I looked at these pictures and I studied the background of these people, basically what you have one, which the pot where you're eating. This is man's world. This is the world we create in order to live. All right, and then you have this guy carrying the natural fern. This is the world that exists. And the question is, these two can be not only symbiotic, but there has to be some sort of balance in between them. So in almost all cultures in the East, which has very civilized sense of values, balance is very, very important. I mean, if you go to India, people would be shocked. They think it's Hindu, but what does Hindu mean? Well, the Hindus acknowledge Buddha, right? The Hindus acknowledge all of these different gods. There's thousands of these gods, and they're all, if you can mentally do this, all these gods are on a shelf, and you can favor one god or another god. You can, take care of the what is necessary for this god, and every day there's something that needs to be done because there's so many of them. You have to make a little sacrifice to this one, is it an auspicious day for that one, and things like this. So there's this sense of balance, that there's not one truth, that there are actually many truths, whereas in Western culture, because it's very aggressive, there's only one truth. Things are black and white. You're either for me or against me. And we see this very, very much so in American attitudes towards everything. I mean, they literally say to people, you have to choose. Are you with us? Or are you with them? And, people's global South has rejected this, especially when it comes to Gaza and Ukraine. They basically said, well, why is a war involving, when it's in Ukraine, involves Europe? Why is that a moral issue? But when We have wars in our backyard. It's just complex. And complex means that we're not really going to do anything about it. And it's not a moral issue. It's really, somehow you're failing as a country, your lack of civilization, your wantings, the fact that you're poor. Well, for a lot in the West, including Donald Trump, they believe that if you're poor, it's God's will, and that's a mark of a disfavor. And there's this kind of a righteousness. This is, by the way, something that the Pilgrims, who first came to America, they were kind of considered a crazy sect at the time. They came and they literally said that if you became rich, then you were blessed by God. You had God's grace. And then this was a sign of God's grace on earth. So you have these very, very different ideas. You have nothing like that. People pray to Buddha, all right, for a child or to get rich and things like this. But that's a personal prayer. It's not something where Buddha decides who's going to do what and things like this. And this is your favor on earth. If I grant this to you, this is just, will you give this to me? Will you help me? Whereas the other side is, God's grace is given to you for no particular reason. It's not because you did good or that you made a prayer. It's just simply, it's Dada-esque in terms of it. So very, very, very different values. And that's what you understand when you're dealing with what purports to be a civilization versus what are acknowledged civilizations.
I find this issue of how people and large groups of people, call them nations or civilizations, cope with difference, both amongst themselves and with others, to be, well, incredibly fascinating, because in some ways, cultural homogeneity to some extent is a necessary part of social cohesion, but the ability to accept within that framework that there is difference, and the difference actually brings something rich and interesting to the overall whole, to also be vital. And I guess what I'm trying to explore a little bit is this idea of how HeHe not only just acknowledges the existence of difference, but becomes a way of addressing balance, not as a static thing, but as something that we must continue to work at, as opposed to a dualist framework of the world, which basically says, look, good and evil are actually given and they're predefined. We just so happen to be on the side of good, and it's therefore our mission to deal with the evil.
Yeah. Well, I mean, her culture is all about the fact that harmony depends on acceptance of differences. And that if you go to this dualist thing, harmony is just not possible, because of course you've divided the world and you're either on one side or the other. How does that create harmony? It's the essence of disharmony. So yes, to put it simply, if I can accept that you're different, you can accept that I'm different, right? And I accept that I don't need to change you. We can discuss, but it's not my job to change you, and it's not your job to change me. Then we can, in fact, live in harmony with our differences. But the moment it becomes, I'm right,
it requires a very particular set of cultivated dispositions too, to be able to carry that off and to pull that off at scale, doesn't it? One of those is patience, for example.
Yeah. But I mean, you see parts of, Aboriginal culture, it was very much about sit down and talk out your differences and things like this. You had this an American Indian culture. South American culture is a little different. They tended to like to sacrifice things. Different, but you have similar things in Africa where it was all about bringing balance by talking things out. In fact, if Afghanistan was left alone, I'm not saying that there would be peace, there are things, but they had what they called a jirga, and this was the meeting of the clans. And the clans, when there were frictions, they gathered together and they'd sit and they'd talk, and they try to figure out the middle way. Not your way or my way, but is there a middle way? Obviously, if you're stronger and you can take over somebody else, for whatever reason you want to put up there, there's nothing you can do. But if it becomes a protracted battle, All right, you have to find some middle way, and this is really where China is. I remember attending a meeting, and there was a very high level Russian official, ex-official there, and there was some very, very senior Chinese, and they were trying to talk to each other. Now the Russian opened up and he said, "This is what I want." Okay, do you agree or don't you agree? And the Chinese kind of like looked at him, and they basically talked in a large circle, but the circle kind of described kind of where his point was, or points, and also where they perhaps could come together. But they weren't trying to be confrontational. They weren't saying no or yes. They were saying, well, how would this work? Here are some of our concerns in a general way, and then trying to figure out how the other one would, how the Russian would respond to that. Actually, he got very, very frustrated, as Americans do, and sometimes Europeans too. They tend to see this as black or white. You either do we have a deal or what? Okay, just tell me. And the Chinese look at you and say, well, why are you being so aggressive? We're talking about this. We're trying to figure out how this will work. We have our own ideas. We're not going to necessarily tell you directly what they are, because we're searching for how these pieces can come together. So that's not just one group of Chinese. You'll run into this time and time again. It's kind of part of the culture. In the U.S. and other countries, it's not part of the culture to demand what you want. That's just kind of an offshoot of, well, you either agree or I'm going to kick your ass.
I was talking with my brother-in-law over the New Year, and talking about these issues of conflict resolution and dealing with difference in families and communities in China. And he said to me, look, much like your remark right at the outset, which is that we've got a long, long history, this civilization, and there's plenty of blood on the hands during the course of that history. But we've also learned that solving problems by resorting to blood on the hands as your first move is very, very costly. And that in between there being a difference of opinion and coming to blows, there's actually almost a never-ending range of possibilities to find a resolution. And he said, it's only taken us a few thousand years to understand that.
I don't think Europe and America are quite there yet.
Look, I wanted to pursue a couple of points. One is probably a practical one, which I'll leave towards the end, which is some of the work that you're actually doing to, I guess, help the world think and act a little bit more around this, around the challenges of dealing with difference. But you've also spoken a lot about consensus as actually being not just an outcome of something, but a way of getting to that outcome, that process. And you sort of hinted at that through this process of talking it through. And I guess I want just for you to fill that in a bit, and also draw in, I guess, some of the remarks that you made in a recent article that was published on China diplomacy. And I'll put the links in the description later for viewers to check up for themselves. But you talk a bit about how in a multipolar world, or to use more of the language we've been using today, in a world where there is a lot of difference, that navigating that actually requires a level of mutual understanding that perhaps doesn't yet exist today.
Well, yeah, actually, I'm going to answer in reverse order. The work that I'm doing is directly related to the aims, and I'm a founding partner of something called the Center for China and the World, and we have other partners. Taihe Institute is one of them. You're part of the Taihe Institute, just full disclosure, as am I. And it's the thing that strikes me is that metrics. The metrics of the world have been defined for the last 350 years by guess who? The dominant cultures. And those have been primarily mercantilistic, colonialist. So they define the world in terms of what value do you have to me? Do you have gold? Do you have silver? Do you have oil? Do you have slaves? What can I take from you? I get it. I mean, there's no better example than India when it's before the British came. What was known as India today was 24% of the world's GDP. When the British left, it was 4%. That's actually talks to the kind of rapacious nature of colonialism. So they defined everything. So you go to the World Bank, you go to the IMF, you go to the United Nations, and you look at the data sets that they're offering, and it's always about these kind of economic things. Very, very short shrift is given to differences of political systems. It's really just put you're either a democratic or authoritarian or something like that. And it's just literally there's absolutely nothing talking about culture. I mean, yes, they have they have World Heritage sites and things like this, but they don't really get into the individual cultures of countries. I tend to believe, as we've been talking about, that cultures are extremely important, especially to those in the countries. And if you don't understand not only the language, but the culture, the true culture, it's going to be very hard to reach consensus. And if you can't reach consensus, then you're going to have strife and conflict. So in a multipolar world where it's necessary for groups of countries to come together, either as an entirety or as a collective regional basis or whatever basis, to make agreements, there has to be a level of understanding. So the work that I'm doing is we're putting out a set of books, mostly concentrated on the Belt and Road Initiative countries. There's 152 of them that attended the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road. And we're targeting those countries, and we are asking them to define themselves, not only in terms of the economic and political aspirations, but also what is a culture. And we've said, we've contacted the embassies, and they're very, they say, oh, this is great. I love this. I was talking to a couple of ambassadors yesterday, and they said, yeah, this is exactly, we need to start expressing ourselves instead of being defined by countries who see us in a completely different light. So they need to identify who are their important authors, what were the historical events that shaped their country, who are the figures that people admire, what historical points should people pay attention to, philosophers, poets, music writers. And I don't mean just in the past. You have to also do a contemporary, who are the contemporary forces? How do people regard other cultures? How do they regard their own culture and things like this? Once you have that, it's not like one person is going to know all 152 countries, but obviously there has to be within all countries an understanding. And right now, a lot of people I talk to in the Chinese government are very anxious to tell the Chinese story. And I've said to them repeatedly, if you want somebody to listen to your story, perhaps it's best to first listen to theirs. Because if you don't understand them, what you say in your story might not make a lot of sense to them. They might not have any relevancy. So if you can tell your story in a way that is responsive to their story, gee whiz, you might actually communicate. So we're putting together this book series. I think it's important, as I said, to have a reference series that is defined by the governments. People will say, oh, well, why are you allowing the government? I don't like that government. Maybe they'll say things I don't agree with. I said, that's not your issue. The issue is that they are the government in control. They're going to define what it is. Their governments will change. When those change, their story can change, and they can draw, say whatever they want to it. One thing this series will not do, though, is will not deal with the politics of other nations. So, for instance, if you're in Africa, this series will not talk about what are my problems with my neighboring African countries. This is purely internal definition. Who are we? What is important to us? What are our aspirations as a nation? What do we think we need help with? Right? What is important? How do we read history? How do we see our social structure? Right? These are very important, and you can't just poo-poo it because you have your own sense of ideas. I have my sense about the importance of accepting people the way they are, but not all cultures do. And your idea that you're going to force them to accept your definition, well, that goes to this kind of right and wrong issue, that I'm right, you're wrong, you have to accept this. that there's some sort of universal value that I'm in possession with that you don't understand, and therefore maybe I have to punish you economically or kinetically or whatever. That has to be pushed aside, and that is really the largest contribution that China is making. China has made three, in terms of a new world order, they have suggested three primary principles based on this idea that, okay, we don't have to agree, but we do have to get along. And what are those principles? Global security initiative. Every country should be secure, and no country's security should depend on the insecurity of other countries. All right. Second, there has to be development, global development initiative. There has to be some way in which we can see bettering the lives of our people. And once again, not at the expense of others, but in a win-win situation where we can take what we have of value and trade it or figure out ways of creating value that are unique to us, or that allow us to go forward. And a large part of that is one of your favorite subjects, which is technology, because there are many people today who believe that those who own the IP today will be served by those who don't tomorrow. That could be one of the widest gaps in terms of creating have and have-nots that we've seen in a long time, because it's so technical, so specialized. And then the third one is the civilizational initiative, global civilization initiative. And what that stands for is there has to be understanding and respect for each country. You cannot define them simply along your own lines and demand that they acquiesce. This is not the colonial times. These countries actually do value themselves. They actually do think that they have quite a bit to offer. And if you don't respect that, obviously it will eventually lead to conflict. So China is saying, look, we're all going to have disagreements. We have different cultures, but like Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, if we come together, we can make each other's thoughts richer. We can have a greater understanding of each other. And through that understanding, have acceptance. I understand what you're talking about. It's not my culture. I don't necessarily agree with it. I believe something different, but I understand it. And therefore, I can accept that you believe in it. If we can do that, we can get to this kind of Westphalian idea without, hopefully, all the bloodshed that accompanied it beforehand.
Well, hopefully we won't have 30 years of war again before we reach another position in the world where differences accept each other and do so with a modicum of humility. On that note, Einar Tangen, can I just thank you for your time and your experience and your wisdom and sharing it with folk around the world. I hope that through these sorts of dialogues, people have the means by which they can reflect on themselves as much as anything and think about how they view the world and how they want to relate to others and for others to relate to them. So once again, thanks for your time.
Warwick, always a pleasure. I would just have one shout out to people, and said, I express my ideas, but I recognize that there are many others. The heart of what we do is to discuss and understand, not to impose.
Absolutely. Thanks again.